Yeah, it's a pleasure to be invited here. Yeah, I will give you a short presentation about an effort that we did a few years ago at the EA, and we had the report on the status of the art in Europe about the climate change adaptation, as it was presented from Liviu, and also the disaster risk reduction, the other twin approach, which has been developed in a different way in the world and in Europe. And we tried a few years ago to see how this two approach, which actually they're ending to the same objective, how they've been integrated and how they've been working more in a coherent way. So I'm not going to go through the definition of a climate change adaptation because it's been already presented before. The disaster risk reduction, which is an older definition, it works more on the resilience, on the vulnerability, on preventing the risk. So he has a more risk approach. But the IPCC in the stress report of 2012, for the first time, it tried to make a merging of the terminology more from the climate change adaptation, more from the climate science, and also from the protection, from the disaster risk reduction. So this is the report which we published at the end of 2017, which was the first report trying to analyze at the European level this synergy, the potential and the already developed synergy at the Europe level between climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. You can find this report, as you can see in the bottom of the slide, at the website of the EA. And we analyze in this report the policy support and relevant for CCA DRR at that time. And we also made an assessment of the knowledge base on the weather and climate related hazards. We selected 18 case studies all over Europe, from the north to the south, east and west, and we defined some good practice example of the good linking between CCA and DRR. So this is our cover of the report, and actually here we show a nature-based solution, as it was presented before from Livio, a renaturalization of a river to prevent flooding. So basically, to try to give space, to give room to the river, and this is one approach that has been developed for a long time in Netherlands. And here we are close to the city of Betuwe, which you can see far away. And so giving space, giving room to the river is a way to do nature-based solution, to do adaptation, to also increase the preservation of biodiversity, stopping the degradation of ecosystem. And also sometimes you can also have natural parks. So you can also you can have also additional benefit like well-being and also good for health and for the tourism sector. So we decided to give this as a positive solution already in 2017 as a very good way to have a synergy between climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So just briefly, why we were interested about this two approach. First of all, because the disaster risk reduction has been, until a few years ago, was much more developed at the global level because it was coming from the civil protection, from the remediation of disaster. So the disaster risk reduction works with a different kind of risk from geophysical, so earthquakes, volcanic eruption, and also for climate and weather related hazards. Instead, the climate change adaptation, as you know, started to be developed around 20 years ago. So I recall the first document which was mentioning climate change adaptation at the European Union was the paper Winning the Battle Against Climate Change in 2005. And for that time, I remember there was some explanation about the need to do more adaptation at the European level. So they have a different origin, but they've been developed in a parallel way, and climate change adaptation in the last 10 years has been accelerating a lot. So one, climate change adaptation is originating from the climate science, from the IPCC. IPCC made a lot of effort from the third assessment report in 2001 to push more for adaptation beside mitigation and to give the state of the art of the research on adaptation. Instead, as I said before, the disaster risk reduction is more related to the culture in humanitarian system and civil protection. The actor for climate change adaptation, traditionally in all the European countries, are more the environmental ministry and the environmental agency. Instead, for the disaster risk reduction, the civil protection agency and ministry. But both of them, they reduce the vulnerability and they increase the resilience of society. So it is really important to try to work in synergy between these two communities. And the benefits are multiple: enhanced knowledge base, avoiding waste of reducing the overspending and also the underspending. So to put the budget all together, to try to work in a coherent way, stronger collaboration, and a better prevention and preparedness. So there are many different policy initiatives which are relevant for climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. I don't want to mention because they've been already mentioned from Livio, from the previous speaker. So, but I just mentioned the Sendai framework, which is a very key agreement on disaster risk reduction. Was for the first time they define climate change as a very important driver for disaster risk. We have the Agenda for Sustainable Development and the World Humanitarian Summit, the Urban Habitat, and all, this was the state of the policy up to 2017. And now we have more, and we are looking forward for the COP26 this year for the UNFCCC, but also there is also some other initiative, as Diego has been outlined, also at the European level, inside of the roadmap of the European Green Deal. So what we did in this report, we defined natural hazards from climate and weather origins, so weather and climate related hazard, and we categorize in 3 different categories: hydrological, so the river flood, the landslide, avalanche, meteorological, and the climatological. Just very briefly, I want to show you just a couple of slides about the state of the impacts of these weather and climate related hazards in Europe. As you can see, the extreme heat waves, I think most of us remember the extreme heat wave which hit the Western Europe in the summer of 2003. And this was an extreme heat wave, was defined as a very, very high, intense extreme heat waves. According to the projection of climate, around the half of the century, as you can see, south of Europe will be hit from these extreme heat waves more frequently. And the estimation from the projection is about 1 extreme heat wave around a decade or less than a decade. If we keep on going on, and this is basically with a scenario from the old IPCC scenario, which is in the middle. So we do some mitigation, but not too much. We don't have a Paris Agreement installed in an efficient way at the global level, but we have some mitigation. If we keep on going like that, we're going to we're going to get at the end of the century a very large number of more frequent extreme heat waves like the 2001 in 2003 in Europe, and we're going to have one of them every 2 or 3 years. So this is really to keep in mind that the heat waves are a climatological hazard which with a good prevention we can reduce the impact, so especially the fatalities and also the impact on the agriculture, on the biodiversity, on the water resource. By the end of the century, the heavy rain projection, they show basically a stronger precipitation on average in the summer in the north and northeast, but especially in the north, and instead the central West Europe and the South Europe will be experienced to less precipitation, heavy rain events. Now, I just move very, very briefly to the last other, which I want to just give you some evidence, is about the forest fires, which is really hitting now, is becoming a really important other to be dealing with in our summer in Europe. And as you can see, this is the baseline from the past decade. So we have that Europe, South Europe is under a very high risk of forest fire, but with the time being, with no adaptation, with no mitigation, the Central Europe and the South Scandinavia will be under a medium and high risk if we keep on going in the decades further. And the South Europe will remain under very high risk. And I recall that in the south of Scandinavia, in south of Sweden, we already experienced in the last years a large forest fire, especially in this south part of Sweden. This is a time series. All this data, all this indicator you can find on the website of the European Environment Agency. And here, this is another indicator. We basically show the economic damage, the direct economic damage from the weather and climate extreme events from 1980 to 2019. And here we have the same category which we have been showing in the report. So the climatological, the hydrological, and the meteorological events. As you can see, is difficult to see a trend in the total number of the direct economic damage from the stream event, because we have different way of reporting damage. We still don't have at the European level a consistent, homogenized, and coherent way to report on disaster loss. But we can say that from the projection we can see a trend on extreme heat waves, as I showed before. We have a trend on floods, and we have a trend especially in extreme event precipitation. So this will produce, if we just focus on intense precipitation events and heat wave, will produce a trend in the next decades, and we have to deal with that with adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So this is just a few lines which they summarize what I've been showing to you about the climate, the hydroclimate and weather extreme event, especially about the direct cost of the damage. So as you can see, we have that from 1980 to 2019, we estimated around 450 billion of euro of damage as a direct cost. And more or less per year, this means around 11, 12 billion per year. And the highest economic loss, direct economic loss, are in Germany, Italy, and France. And actually, as was mentioned before from Livio, only about 1/3 of the total loss, which will be monitored, which we've been assessing in this record from 1980 to 2019, have been insured. So the protection gap is very important to try to fill. We need really to increase the use of smart risk transfers through insurance scheme, applied in a different way and in a more larger way in our countries. So we define 6 good practices in our report. I'm ending to the conclusion of my presentation. So one is the Delta program to manage with water resource and flooding in Netherlands, because it's a program which has a long-term approach for decades. It has an adequate funding and is a very coherent, working in a synergetic way with climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So he has a very good integration about these two approach. And also another, as a risk transfer scheme, as an insurance scheme, we found some scheme for climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction in Spain for the agriculture, the French catastrophic natural in France, and also in UK. Switzerland, we found a very good integration and multi-level governance dealing with disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation in Switzerland. We also find that some countries that be developing more complete national risk assessment, try to integrate in better the climate, all the different climate hazards, but from an adaptation point of view, also from a disaster risk point of view. And the UK is one of them. And also the city networks, we found that are playing a very important role in outreaching the need to integrate more these two approaches. And finally, we think that the nature-based solutions are a very relevant, integrated solution for climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So our conclusion from the report, which are still on and which we think that the new adaptation strategy can play a big role on trying to addressing also this recommendation in our report, are that we need to improve and to have a larger use of European and national and regional platform on climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. We need to have more in Europe, multi-hazard mapping and risk assessment, more climate service for adaptation and disaster risk reduction, long-term national approach, as has been developed in Netherlands and in some other few countries in Europe. Natural-based solutions are key for increasing this integration. And the risk prevention financing is also very important. And now we have a new possibility of funding for MBS and for adaptation in the new budget of Europe, and this will play a bigger role. And finally, we need to have installed a monitoring and evaluation of policy, as we already have in some initiative at the city level and the national level, but we need to develop more this scheme of monitoring, reporting, and evaluation. Most of this information, I would say 99% of this information, you can find in English in our platform at the EA, which is called the Climate Adapt, which is also a part of the of the European adaptation strategy, and also is including all the overview of all the national adaptation strategy and plan of all the European Union country, but also the EA member states, so of the larger Europe. We have so far 32 countries which are reporting to us about the state of the art, their progress in adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So I'm concluding my presentation, and it's very important to understand that, as it was mentioned from Livio, we need to do adaptation and disaster risk reduction in a systemic way. So we have to basically mainframe, we have to try to integrate these two concepts in all our policy at the national, regional, local level. We need to address all the different sector and the intersectorial aspects, and we need to be smart, so to do in a more efficient way and also fast. And this is very important, because what we spend now is going to be always less of what we can spend for disaster in few years or decades in the next future. You can find in a few weeks a new report, which is a report which I coordinated and contributed. It took a couple of years of work with also a group of experts from different European countries. Is a report which is devoted only to natural-based solution in Europe, policy, knowledge, and practice for climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And I think this is the continuation, we can call this as a continuation of the previous report, which will be published in 2017. We're going to have a Facebook event on the 27th of April, and this report will be available on our website at the EA around the 14th, 15th of April.